Alrighty, so off the back of Tyrannical Afflicted Bolstering, or as I like to call it, Tyrannical Fortified, we are now getting Fortified, which is going to be Fortified, Incorporeal, and Sanguine. Two back-to-back, honestly, not great weeks. Fortified, of course, is a fine affix. Incorporeal is an affix that requires a decent amount of group coordination, kind of similar to where Afflicted lands, but even a bit harder because it has to be, a lot of times, like casted CC. It also eats any CC that you would otherwise have used on the mobs themselves. And then the final affix, Sanguine. I think that Sanguine is probably one of the affixes that I see pugs complain about the most. I feel like Sanguine and Bursting are the ones that I see more often than not people just complaining about, by and large. More often than not, it's because like mobs aren't being moved enough. You know, the mobs are standing there healing. Sanguine actually got nerfed coming into this patch to no longer have multiple stacks, so you can't like full heal a mob from a 10 stack of Sanguine immediately, which is nice. But at the same point, Sanguine is still rather challenging for most players because it creates invisible time losses. Basically, if you don't manage Sanguine perfect, then you're going to be costing yourself a lot of time. And there are some keys that are going to be more annoying than others in this. I think that Everbloom, Throne of the Tides, and Rise are probably the ones that are the easiest to kind of mess up with Sanguine healing, where Rise, it's pretty easy to Sanguine heal the mini bosses in the first area, unless your tank's movement is perfect. In Everbloom, there are just so many Dread Petals, there's a lot of A-bombs and stuff like that, that you can also just Sanguine heal, unless you have a lot of Nox or like a pretty coordinated group. Throne of the Tides, the Sentries and the Sentinels, I think are the two mobs that, in my mind, have the highest chance to be Sanguined, and so those keys just become a decent amount harder. This is a week that, while it is playable, and I expect people will still play, there is a larger level of difficulty and stress that's going to be applied to your group to be able to achieve similar results that you would otherwise get on a volcanic spiteful week, something like that, right? Or Sanguine and Incorporeal aren't exactly the greatest. All right, beyond that, I'll drop an Incorporeal affix down in the description as well if you want that. It'll kind of tell you when Incorporeal is going to be spawning, how long you have to interrupt it, that kind of thing. I would kind of recommend making sure that you talent your CC. Any spammable CC is obviously preferred. More often than not, this is going to be an augmentation of Evoker and Healer job. That's just like the state of the game. But yeah, that's just how it is. Make sure that I think as long as you give actual effort to CC Incorporeal, in general, pugs are going to have decent success. Obviously, for high groups, things are done a little bit differently. On top of that, we've had pretty interesting class tuning. Not a lot of it really changes or moves the needle on a decent amount of specs whenever you kind of look at what was buffed and nerfed. A lot of it comes down to like the front page of Warcraft logs. So whenever you go to Warcraft logs and you look at like raid damage and stuff like that, a lot of the specs it's just basically buffing a bunch of the specs that were at the bottom of this kind of chart, right? I want to say like the bottom 7 specs got buffed. Where for Mythic Plus, it obviously doesn't matter a ton, but it does kind of help some of, I would describe them as like mid-tier specializations, maybe be a little bit better. Decent buffs to Feral, like you're getting rip damage, rake damage, Primal Wrath, just basically straight across the board. Their dots are being increased. Resto Druid Mana, this is, I would say, one of the only high-tier things that's actually getting any sort of buff. Now, it is a mana buff, which obviously in Mythic Plus, you just kind of like sit down and drink. But this is nice. Anything that's going to allow Resto to have to drink less is going to actually save you time in the key. Seraph Hunter, not too much going on with that. We're not seeing too much. I mean, this is a good buff. You're not like mad about it. Holy Paladin, a little bit of a damage on the Consecration and Shield of the Righteous. I think the large issue with Holy Paladin is their healing throughput, I think is one of the larger complaints with them right now, but Consecration damage and Shield of the Righteous damage is also not bad. Ret, and this is probably one of the largest changes. This is actually a pretty significant damage gain. You get Wake damage, Truth's Wake damage, Blade of Justice, and Final Verdict damage all being increased. I want to say this ended up being about a 7 to 8% damage increase on single target, if the numbers that I had were correct. Which one of the main drawbacks of Ret Paladins is the fact that they don't really necessarily have priority damage, and they don't necessarily do a lot of single target. Now, this is a pretty large buff if you are already going to be playing with the Ret. The biggest thing that a Ret Paladins can do, though, is have the Legendary. Legendary-less Ret, not that great. If you have a Legendary and you are already playing with a Ret Paladin, these buffs are going to be pretty big for you, because I would say Ret is a solid mid-tier option for a lot of groups. They're definitely pretty strong in a comp without an Aug Evoker as well, where they can help you just like increase your group survivability by a decent amount. And if they're actually contributing a decent amount more damage with these buffs, Hey, maybe red's on the table. I don't think it's gonna move itself from like a mid-tier option to like the best option, but I think it could actually see some play. Holy Priest already was very good. Definitely one of the best healers in regards to, not the best, but like a top healer in regards to throughput. Actually contributed a decent amount of damage, and now they buffed the damage of H Priest, which, you know, Sanctify healing and heal also being increased. This is not something that was definitely on my radar. Another mid-tier option that's getting pretty substantial buffs. Shadow started off this patch being fucking awful. And then they got buffed by a significant amount. And now they're getting buffed on their AoE. Once again, they were already good at, you know, single target damage and priority damage. It was already fairly solid. And now Shadowy Apparition damage and Psychic Link damage is being increased. You know, DP and Mind Blast are a bit fine, but the Apparition and Psychic Link damage is definitely something that... So Shadow, that is good. So Shadow probably not going to be meta off the back of this, but you can definitely see Shadow in a lot more compositions. Shadow is already fine in a lot of compositions where you wanted to bring Fortitude, and the Fortitude buff that Shadow Priest brings, especially with the context of this season, is quite strong. Shadow Priest can always keep themselves alive as well with, you know, like Flash Hail DR and stuff like that. And so the fact that they're going to be able to contribute a lot more AoE damage is quite nice. Getting me out of it. Restoration Shaman, you know, their damage is actually being increased by a decent amount, and then all healing increased by 5%. Resto Shaman in 5-mans was already okay. The context of the season looks like if healers are able to keep you alive through one-shot checks, then you're doing your job as a healer. Resto Shaman, I think, was able to kind of do that. Their throughput healing is not bad. Their throughput healing was already not bad. Their damage contribution level was a bit lower than some of the other top options, and it was maybe a little bit worse than Mistweaver at keeping you alive. And so that's why it necessarily wasn't seeing like a ton of play. Now, Lava Burst, Flame Shock, and Lightning Bolt damage being increased, you know, can't be too mad about it. Arms Warrior, still probably one of the worst specs. Fury just kind of generally outclasses it. And that was basically all of the stuff we had in regards to class tuning. Actually, there was some stuff I missed. Unholy DK damage increased. Again, another mid-tier DPS option. Kind of similar vein to Shadow and Ret Paladin. Not bad. Legendary list Unholy, not that great, but, you know, once they get the Legendary, they're definitely online. Their damage is okay. I've seen some groups of the Miraz, and he's playing Unholy, and his damage looks pretty good in some of these dungeons. Looks fairly solid. So, on Blood Death Knight getting an EHP increase versus physical damage, and then I want to say Protware is also getting some tankiness increased as well. I don't think that either of these specializations necessarily were looking for defensive value. This is kind of for Mythic Plus specifically, it's kind of a season where, you know, tanks by and large are able to kind of live everything with good play, and tankiness is not necessarily something that's that most tanks are struggling with. I think that I've seen like Prot Warriors being like, I wish I got a damage buff instead of a like survivability increase, but, you know, it is what it is. Overall, though, Blood Decay and Prot Warrior are probably going to stay in similar spots where they are currently, which is, you know, they're not bad, they're just not great. So yeah, I mean, even if you kind of look at, you know, something like Subcreation, you know, Ret, Unholy, both mid-tier options. Shadow Priest is kind of a mid-tier option. Maybe these things kind of, you know, maybe they can move up a little bit, but I think it's a situation where if you're already playing with one of these, it's definitely going to be a bit better. Update as to some of the bans that we talked about last week. A lot of the bans were actually 7-day bans. There was only a couple that were 6-month bans. People like Rare already back into the fray, back playing again after his 7-day vacation. Ufan also back into the fray after his 7-day vacation. I saw, you know, some people talking about that as well. But yeah, that's kind of an update as to what happened with those bans. They were only a week-long ban for a lot of the RMT. Okay, anyways, that's going to be it. Fortified Incorporeal Sanguine, again, affixes that we're going to see this week, and I will see you guys in next week's video.